There we go. Please forgive my puppy in advance. This is Paula. There's someone in the yard. But he's far enough away. I hope he doesn't interrupt too much. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Executive Director Call. I'm Paula McElwee, and I'm the Director of Technical Assistance for the ILNet, which includes ILRU. I'm a silver-haired, blue-eyed, Scottish-complected older woman in a, I don't know what color's my jacket, a check jacket and a leopard print shirt. Uh-oh, I'm mixing prints. And this is our monthly call. I've got a couple of people who are helping me with this call today because I have to step away unfortunately. Scott Birkenbuhl is here. Wave, Scott. And he's co-hosting along with Joy Vega, who's helping with all the technical side of things. So, so that the call will continue without me at the end of this period. So we do ask that you remember that we are recording only the first part of this call. So we'll be showing a short PowerPoint presentation on the topic, and then we will turn off the recording and open it up for discussion on the topic. So if you have anything, you're welcome to ask questions or make comments throughout. But if you do that while the PowerPoint is up, that comment will be recorded and will be on our website. So if there's something you want to ask that's sensitive, you may want to write it down and hold it for after we close the PowerPoint presentation. Then we have a little more private discussion. It doesn't get posted on our website. It's just between those of us who are here. So keep that in mind. And this topic may have some sensitive elements to it. Well, because we're going to talk about what a center isn't and what a center shouldn't do. So as we approach those elements, there may be some situations where you inherited something that really isn't the best independent living practice. And you may or may not want to talk about that with the group as a whole, but you're certainly welcome to do that either recorded during the PowerPoint or after when it's not recorded. Scott, do you want to introduce yourself before we go on to the PowerPoint?
There, took me a second to get myself unmuted. I'm Scott Birkenbuhl, and I'm the CEO of Ability Montana, and which is a Center for Independent Living in Southwest Montana. And I've been involved in, I have a disability myself, and I've been involved in independent living, either on the board of the organization that I'm now leading, and then as an operations officer for it. So probably altogether, I've been with this organization for about 11 years now.
Scott is one of our technical assistance people that you might get referred to sometimes when you ask for technical assistance, which I'll remind you is available to you free of charge anytime around, especially around regulations or practices that are helpful to your center. So just kind of keep that in mind and feel free to contact us. One other announcement I want to make before we pull up the PowerPoint, and that is this, that we do have a directory of centers and silks. It's on our website, and your center is probably listed there. We don't keep that up to date unless you tell us to. So pull up your listing sometime at ilru.org. There's a place on the left-hand column, not the far left, but the middle column, the left of the two middle columns, for a directory of centers for independent living, and you can click on that, go to your state, pull up your listing, and send an email if there's anything about it that's not correct. And bless his heart, Joey just posted that link for you in the chat. So there you go. And I think we're ready to look at our topic on the PowerPoint. If Joey would share his screen. We're going to talk a little bit. Let's take the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about what a center is and what a center isn't. And I always go back to this paragraph. You probably, if you have hung with me through very many calls, it shows up more often than it doesn't. And this is the purpose of Title VII of the Rehab Act. It's right in the law itself. This is not the whole thing. There's more, but this is the part that I think really needs to be talked about. Because we talk about the philosophy of independent living and the fact that as a center, you're responsible for implementing that philosophy. So I'm going to read this section. The purpose of Title VII of the Act is to promote a philosophy of independent living, including a philosophy of consumer control. Notice that's first. And this isn't alphabetical. Well, maybe it is. No, it's not. Peer support, self-help, self-determination, equal access, and individual and systems advocacy. That's the philosophy piece. And its purpose is to maximize the leadership, empowerment, independence, and productivity of individuals with disabilities into the and to promote the integration and for inclusion of individuals with disabilities into the mainstream of American society. I'm curious, anything jump out at anybody there in that particular paragraph? Anything that you're seeing there that you'd like to? You can drop it in the chat, or you can just unmute your phone and jump in. But any words there that really click with you, that make you say, aha, aha. Anything there? Well, you'll have other opportunities. Let's go to the next slide. So when independent living grants were first established, that purpose statement wasn't in there. And in fact, there's quite a bit that was messy. For one thing, independent living was a part of the disability culture at a time when it wasn't easy to connect with each other. We didn't even have email, folks. We didn't even have email, much less texting and other kinds of connections. So you had sometimes connections within your own state. There were councils and other entities. Certainly the Department of Rehab that managed all of these in the beginning was there. But that's who wrote the grants. And so they didn't necessarily really know what consumer control was and hadn't really thought about that. And so they wrote the grants for entities that weren't necessarily consumer controlled. Here's an example. This example is from my center. So I'm just going to put it out there that in the beginning, the local consumer group asked the DD agency in our area to write the grant for them. They didn't feel like they could manage a grant. They didn't feel comfortable doing that. We did write the grant for them. I was the director at the time. I didn't feel like I had a disability I could claim. And so I backed out almost immediately and pushed somebody else forward who did have a visible disability because I felt like that was important. But the DD agency was actually who was in charge. And while the local consumer group formed a kind of a council that helped that center get established, it was a few years before it was established on its own and had its own staff. And I know of another center that took decades to get that done. So it was allowed because it was a Part B center, it was allowed and the state didn't do anything about it, but it was not really consumer control. So it was messy. Some of the grants also went to single disability organizations. So an organization that served only deaf or only blind or, Paraquad, what do you think the name of that was, right? It wasn't initially cross disability. It was, for people with mobility disabilities specifically. So that happened across the country. Next slide, please. We had to do something about that. So the movement, the people, we wrote the language of the amendments to the Rehab Act to begin to make sure that independent living was really independent living, because in the beginning it wasn't, or it wasn't consistently so. The Silks came out of part of that. In the beginning, the Silks were designed to follow the rehab councils. So you all know about the rehab councils in your state. Designed to kind of follow that model, or the DD councils. Same thing, it's a council appointed in the law that establishes the funding. So needed something similar for our state, but to begin with, they were part of the DSU. That's what we called the designated state entity before it was the designated state entity, it was the designated state unit. Had different responsibilities as a result, was pretty much in charge. And so that needed to be corrected to become consumer controlled. And the language in the Rehab Act around the Silk consumer control is pretty strong. It's been amended a couple of times in order to accomplish that. And there were leaders who were clearly people with significant disabilities in every sector of this, that meaning that the DSE level or DSU level, at the Silk level, at the SIL level, there were leaders clearly throughout that and throughout the country. But the Rehab Act is 50 years old now. And so we need to ask ourselves, are we due for another self-correction? If so, what should we do to get back to the root of IL? Or there are things that we want to do that are different from what IL has been? And are SILs truly being led by people with disabilities? Meaning that the board, the leadership, and the people providing the services, the majority of all of those need to be people with disabilities. And as you've heard me say before, 51% of one, if you only have one leader in the organization, 51% of one is one. In fact, if you only have two leaders, 51% of two is two. Both must be people with disabilities. Let's look at that next slide. So here are some things that centers are not. And if you feel like this needs a conversation, remember that as soon as we turn off the PowerPoint, we can have a pretty open conversation here. But centers are not day programs. There are centers that have operated day programs. There may be centers that are still operating day programs, although that's really not independent living. Remember that language back in the purpose statement talked about being in the community. And so to have a segregated site where people come to your center every day and are segregated every day from the community does not meet the IL philosophy. It's not a full-time recreation program. You know, wouldn't we love it? And we do sometimes do recreation. I'm not saying we don't. It's a skill we need to learn. And so you can see it as an independent living skill sometimes to be involved in recreation, or also to be involved in the, in the arts community, or to be involved in the, acting in a play, or, all kinds of community-based things. Recreation being one of them, can be a part of independent living skills training. But we are not a full-time recreation program. And I did have one center that I visited where that was what they did. And they, they had a calendar, and they had recreational activities every single day. don't we all wish we had time to do that every single day? But anyway, that's not what a center is. We're not a full-time recreation program. We're there in order to build that disability community and to make changes so that society is accessible to us. And recreation is not the only way we can get that done. We are not sheltered workshops, and we should not be paying sub-minimum wage for anybody. And I have known centers who've gone to the local sheltered workshop and said, let me hire your cleaning crew to come and clean my offices. Well, I would ask first off, is that cleaning crew being paid minimum wage or better? Because you should not be paying sub-minimum wage as a center for independent living. A center for independent living is not a place where people who do real work are volunteers. I bring this one up because I've seen this more than once, where a center says, well, they want to work here, but they don't want to lose their benefits. And so they decided they'd volunteer for us instead of being employees. Now, you need to stop first of all and ask yourself, what does the Department of Labor say about the difference between an employee and a volunteer? Because there is a difference. And if you're expecting people to do the things an employee would do, then you need to work with them on how their benefits are going to sort out and what they want to do about it. But you can't just make them volunteers. I picked some of the most, what's the word to say? Some of the most controversial things that I actually see centers doing. Centers for independent living are not representative payees. We do not remove people's rights. It's also the guardianship, which is the next bullet point. So centers for independent living work with people to restore their rights, work with people to maintain their rights. What do they need to do in order to manage their own funding? How do we get from where they are to that place? What do they need to do to manage their own rights? Do they need a team of people that support them, but without taking away their legal rights? And there are ways to do all of those things that we aren't going to get into right this minute. But centers for independent living are not places that can't afford interpreters. If you have ever said that, shame on you. Because we serve people who are deaf. I understand that you might not have a full-time interpreter on staff. So if somebody shows up at your door, you might have to figure out how you're going to communicate in the short term as they first connect with you. And you need a plan for that. You need to know who are your interpreter services that you can access via Zoom. You know, what can you do in order to make sure that you have interpreter services available? But for service delivery, writing notes does not suffice. Nor does the staff person who knows a little sign language. You know, I fit into that category, and my signs, first of all, are old because I learned it in the 70s in the middle of the country. So it's not at all the same as what's being used around me most of the time. And it would not be okay for me to assume that I can communicate sufficiently with a person who's deaf who comes to our front desk. So I hope that makes sense. And CILs are not places where it's okay to be inaccessible for any disability at any level. I've visited centers that are not that you could not roll a wheelchair into yourself. Now, that one of these that I visited, the problem was that the bus stop was the top of a very steep hill. There was entry into the building that the landlord would not allow the center to use. It went into another unit where there was another business. So the only way to get to the center was to go down this very steep hill and go in an entry at the ground level down below. Well, if you were pushing your own wheelchair, you could not do that safely, and you couldn't get back to the bus stop at the end of the day. And if you had, even if you had an electric chair and not a manual one, I would question because it was so steep. That was not okay. And I regret that I had to say that out loud to people at that center and shake them up a little bit because they didn't understand that that was not okay. So it's an interesting dilemma to take a look at. Let's look at the next slide. I got to go a little faster here. There's a full list of the standards and assurances linked from our website, and it includes the specific federal regulations that cite these things, but a center is required to promote and practice the independent living philosophy, that statement up front in the purpose statement, provide the core services, I think most of you know that, provide other independent living services, and there's actually a list, and you've just done your PPR, so you probably remember what some of those other services are because you've just had the time to do that recently. Facilitate the development of consumer IL goals. Work to increase the availability and improve the quality of community options for independent living. So we're required to be out in the community, improving the options that people have for increasing their independence. Conduct activities to increase the capacity of communities to meet the needs of individuals with significant disabilities. And conduct resource development to obtain funding so we can afford to do some of these other things that we're required to do. Next slide, please. We're also, CILs are designed by individuals with disabilities and operated as cross-disability, community-based, community-driven, it probably should say community-controlled entities. And sometimes people will ask me, well, how do we provide independent living skills training, for example? Well, you get to decide that. See, designed by individuals with disabilities at your site. So you get to decide what does that look like. You need to comply with the standards in the law. You need to have an annual and 3-year program and financial plan that align with your spill, and your PPR also asked about this. So it should be something fresh in your mind from that process as well. You need to use sound organizational and personnel practices with an emphasis on hiring and promoting individuals with disabilities. You need to ensure that the majority of your staff are individuals with disabilities, including the majority of staff in decision-making roles. You need to prepare and submit an annual report, which is called a PPR or a 704 report. The form still says 704. You present that to the DSE if your funding is all Part B, or you've already submitted it to ACL if you're a Part C center, hopefully. Next slide. You also are required to notify consumers about the client assistance program, to conduct aggressive outreach. Notice that wording is actually in the law. Aggressive outreach to people with significant disabilities who are unserved or underserved. You need to make sure that there's training for your staff on how to serve unserved and underserved individuals with significant disabilities. You need to submit to the state Silk a copy of your grant application if you still have it. Of course, they should already have that one, but any new ones, and submit your PPR to your Silk. You're required to do that annually. And you must develop independent living plans for consumers unless the consumer waives that and says it's unnecessary. Next slide. So the question that I would have about consumer control is, does the board really get it? That they are in control as people with significant disabilities? Do they understand what consumer control or disability run means day to day? And do they understand that law and how that works? And I'm sorry, I have already changed this script for something else, and I put the state of Montana in there, and I didn't mean to. That's your state too. So what are the requirements in the law? How does ACL interpret the law about consumer control? Well, they want to see more than 51%, but they also want to see that the board is actually making the planning decisions for your SIL, that it's coming from the disability community in other ways that the board gets input, and that your plans actually flow from the community, the disability community in your area. Next slide, please. So how do you avoid stagnant boards is a question. SILs are not required to have term limits, but should they? I think so. Just my personal opinion. It doesn't have to be short-term limits. It can be 3 3-year terms and a 9-year total, but you need some way to have people go off a board, because if you don't, then you sometimes get stuck with people forever. You need to look at conflict of interest. It still applies, but it's different because a person who's on the board who has a disability may come to you for services. And that's different than most places, right? It's also true that a staff person could need services. And you have to figure that out. What does that look like? And what's that? How do you avoid conflict of interest and still understand that people might receive services? And how do you train your board to know all this stuff? Because at the end of the day, if the executive director leaves for any reason, the board suddenly becomes in charge. And if the board doesn't know any of this stuff, they don't know what to do next. And sometimes they don't make good decisions that are IL strong because they don't know. They don't know what's required. Let's look at the next slide. 4 more minutes. So what needs to change and how do we get there? That's the topic for the discussion. I think we're at the end of the presentation, right? Let me look.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So there you are. I'm going to jump off and leave you to that discussion. Have fun. It's a fun one. Scott's going to take the lead on that. Joey's there to help support as needed. And we're going to turn off the recording. And it's up under here.